Okay, tonight's speaker is Dr. Katja Günther. You see her name and title up there on the board. It really is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce her because she, in fact, is also a medical doctor, and she's a PhD doctor, so maybe it should be Dr. Doctor. Professor Günther specializes in the history of modern medicine and the mind sciences. She's a trained physician, as I mentioned, who's worked in hospitals in Germany, France, and the UK. And she holds a research degree in neuroscience from Oxford University. In the year 2000, she got her MS, Master's of Science, from Oxford. And in 2003, from the Cologne University in Cologne, Germany, she received her. As Dr. Günther was telling me, she realized soon thereafter that she was really interested in the academic area of the history of medicine and came to the United States, went to Harvard University, received a PhD from Harvard in the history of science as recently as June 2009, and directly from there has come to the faculty at Princeton. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of History and the program of History of Science. I know that she is currently teaching a course, History 395, in the history of medicine and the body. And I really appreciated one of the things that was in her CV. Since I can hardly get by in English, she is a German speaker, a near native English speaker, advanced French speaker, a basic Spanish speaker, and has reading knowledges in both Latin and ancient Greek. So I tell you, we're in for a great treat, I'm sure, tonight. As you can see, the title of tonight's lecture is "The Hypnotist, the Photographer, and the Doctor: Hysteria and the Making of Psychoanalysis." Please welcome Dr. Günther. I'm going to turn the lights down so that you can see the projection. It's on, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction. And
can you all hear?
Is this better? Shall we switch it on?
This one goes up a little bit.
And I usually turn this off to avoid feedback. Here, right? Yes.
And that one should be muted?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's give it a try.
Yeah, okay. Is this better? Yeah, well, again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight about Freud and psychoanalysis. It's really an honor, and I look forward to it. I want to begin my lecture by asking, is there feedback a little bit, right? Maybe I should turn it down again.
They want a light on you.
Try this. I think we probably need this because we need the projection.
Okay.
Yeah. Is this okay? Just let me know if it doesn't project enough. Like this? Better? Okay, great. So I want to begin my lecture with a simple question, which is, what is psychoanalysis? It's a deceptively simple question. Because we all have an idea of what psychoanalysis is. So we think of Sigmund Freud, we think of a specific type of clinical encounter involving a couch. We think perhaps also of a specific turn of the 20th century culture. We think Vienna around the turn of the 20th century. But the question isn't actually that easy to answer because psychoanalysis is actually a difficult thing to describe and to account for. And what makes it so difficult to grasp is in particular that different people involved in psychoanalysis see it as different things. Here you see an image of one of Freud's drawings of the nervous system, which he made in 1878. At the time, he was a student in the laboratory of the physiologist Ernst Brücke in Vienna. I'll show you an image of Brücke later. So even though Freud's later work and his better-known work was in clinical medicine, not in laboratory medicine, he actually spent almost 2 decades working at the bench in the laboratory of Brücke from the 1870s into the 1890s. And this, as you can imagine, also contributed to his view of psychoanalysis. So he saw psychoanalysis also as a science grounded in physiological facts. Then psychoanalysis is a therapeutic technique. So if you ask a practitioner today, a psychoanalytic practitioner today, or in the early 20th century, they will say that psychoanalysis is a very effective form of treatment. And this resonates with our ideas of psychoanalysis as well. If we hear psychoanalysis, we think of talk therapy, we think of the couch. And here you see a classical satirical account of the encounter between analyst and patient, the patient lying on the couch, the analyst sitting beside him. And actually the patient should be talking in a psychoanalytic setting and not the therapist. And then psychoanalysis is also often seen as a hermeneutic or interpretative technique, an art of listening. And as such, it becomes uncoupled from its scientific claims. And in this sense, psychoanalysis moves out of the realm of science into the humanities, which is why Freud today is often taught and mostly taught in literary and philosophy departments. In fact, he's found there more often than in psychology or physiology departments. And a couple of years ago, when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I did a search on the Harvard course catalog for courses that include Freud in the title, Freud or psychoanalysis in their title and description. And you see the result, I've put it up there. It's 12 courses in literature departments, 6 in historical studies, 1 in anthropology, and only 1 in psychology. But Freud and psychoanalysis aren't just to be found within the boundaries of the academy or the clinic. They're also part of a broader cultural phenomenon. And in the Western world, psychoanalysis has become one of the most pervasive forces of middle-class life. I'll play the clip in a second. And as such, it often has been ridiculed. A place where this happens a lot is Woody Allen movies. And here's a brief sketch from Annie Hall, which I'll show to you. So Woody Allen has been seeing a psychoanalyst for 15 years at the time of this exchange, and Diane Keaton is surprised, but she actually isn't too surprised. This is just what middle-class New Yorkers would do or did in the 1970s. So what is psychoanalysis? Is it a science? Is it a field within the humanities? Is it a therapeutic technique? Or is it a broader cultural practice? In this lecture, I will give an answer to the question by looking into some of the historical origins of psychoanalysis. And for this, I will take you on a tour through 19th century Paris and fin de siècle Vienna. So I'm approaching the Victorian era, that is the topic of the course from a continental perspective tonight. And on this tour, I'll study in detail a disease called hysteria, and the treatment of that disease in a hospital setting, as well as in private practice. I also pay attention to certain recording techniques that were important in the process of diagnosing the disease, which is photography, at the time a relatively new technology. And in the clinical work on hysteria, the diagnostic and therapeutic technique of hypnosis played a key role, so I focused on that as well. I'll then move on to talk about how psychoanalysis grew out of Freud's work with hysterical patients, and how it developed into a universal theory of the mind. I also discuss some of the problems that were associated with this claim to universality, and touch on the question about the general acceptance of psychoanalysis, discussing the role of the new disease called shell shock in this broad acceptance of psychoanalysis. And I'll end on the legacy of Freud and psychoanalysis. But let me begin my story with the figure behind all this. Who is the man with the dark eyes and the cigar, the man who created psychoanalysis? Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 to a Moravian Jewish family. He always thought of himself as an outsider because of this Jewish heritage, although he wasn't actually religious himself. Instead, he preferred to see himself as a scientist and breaking free from religion, and he eliminated his Jewish middle name. Freud's family had resettled to Vienna, and in 1873, Freud began to study medicine there. But living in Vienna at the time wasn't always simple, especially if you were Jewish. Freud, in fact, shared the feeling of exclusion with many assimilated Austrian Jews. For instance, the composer Gustav Mahler, who is famously quoted as I'm thrice homeless as a native of Bohemia in Austria, as an Austrian among Germans, and as a Jew throughout the world. Everywhere an intruder, never welcomed. So, as I said, to some extent, Freud shared Mahler's feelings. But anti-Semitism hadn't been rampant all the time. Vienna in the 1860s and 70s was indeed a place of liberal optimism. The Habsburg monarchy was making its first steps towards parliamentary democracy. Jews were emancipated and granted legal rights as citizens. And Austrian liberals celebrated a sense of coming to their own, symbolized by the Ringstraße. Here's an image of the Ringstraße in the 1870s. It's the German word for ring road or circular road. And the Ringstraße has been built at the former site of the city walls of Vienna. So the former stronghold of the city walls had been replaced by this open space of the Ringstraße, a site for commercial exchange and transportation. However, the spirit of liberal optimism was broken by a stock market crash, the Black Friday of 1873, and the crash, in fact, turned out to be a decisive moment in the transformation of European politics more broadly. It was blamed on Jews, and anti-Semitism became widespread after that. So by the turn of the century, Vienna politics had become irrational and populist rather than liberal, inspired by anti-Semitism. And Mahler and other people, such as his fellow composer Arnold Schönberg or the satirist Karl Kraus, responded to this growing anti-Semitism by converting from Judaism to Protestantism and Catholicism. Freud, the scientist, set himself apart from this. He didn't seek for salvation in the conversion to a different religion. It's rather the case that his science of psychoanalysis, to him, like for many others, would become a sort of secular religion. So as I mentioned before, Freud entered the university in Vienna in 1873, and there, as a Jew, he immediately faced limits on his career. Very few professions at the time were not governed by guilds and available to him as a Jew. And medicine was one of those few, and that was actually the subject that he chose. And within medicine, Freud was mostly attracted by neurology and clinical psychology. After finishing his studies, he first worked in the laboratory of physiologist Ernst Brücke, where he studied the nervous system of lower vertebrates. And you remember the drawing I showed you at the very beginning. Here's a picture of Ernst Brücke, at whose lab Freud worked. It's an image of the medical professors of the Vienna University in 1853, and Brücke is among them. And Brücke is important for our story here because he advised Freud to give up on his university career. As I said, anti-Semitism made it difficult to pursue a university career, and Brücke recognized this. Plus, he didn't really have a position for Freud in his laboratory that he could offer to him. He already had 2 older assistants, so there wasn't really a need for Freud. Although Freud was actually quite successful in his laboratory work and published widely on his research. So Brücke advised Freud to leave academia and settle down as a nerve doctor to treat patients in private practice. And Freud was open to this idea, especially because he wanted to get married to his long-term fiancée, Martha Bernays. And as a doctor in private practice, he would earn the necessary money for the wedding and for starting a family. But before Freud settled down as a nerve doctor, he won a travel grant to Paris to study with Europe's leading neurologist at the time, Jean-Martin Charcot. So in 1885, he packs his bags to relocate to Paris for a few months. And here, well, here's Paris, and here's an image of Charcot. And Charcot was sometimes called the Napoleon of the neuroses for his resemblance with Napoleon. And it's a resemblance that he liked to cultivate, as you can see from the picture. So Charcot and his work on hysteria are of crucial importance for the genesis of psychoanalysis. So I spent some time talking about Charcot and his medical practice. Charcot's imperial status in neurology was reflected in his workplace, which was very grand. He worked at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. And the Salpêtrière, here's an image of the main entrance of the hospital, was and still is located near the River Seine on the left bank. And as you see on the image, it's an enormous institution. It was a vast complex of streets and gardens and squares and even a church. So you see the church here and the gardens. It was really like a small city unto itself, a city within the city of Paris. And Charcot was neurologist and professor of pathological anatomy at the Salpêtrière, overseeing 3 wards, which you see sketched here. And before Charcot arrived at the Salpêtrière in the 1860s, it had been a poorhouse for women. Several thousand women lived at the Salpêtrière at one time in the 1860s. And here you see a picture of the Salpêtrière courtyard. And Charcot realized that many of the women at the Salpêtrière were suffering from diseases of the nervous system, which he recognized as a great chance for him as someone interested in the nervous system, so he could systematically study the nervous system, having all this material. So he established laboratories, he established clinics and teaching facilities, as a whole turning this former almshouse into one of the most modern hospitals of the day. And what Charcot became most famous for was his work on hysteria. His contribution to the study of hysteria was, in fact, so great that it marked a turning point in the history of the disease. But what kind of disorder is hysteria? If we refer to someone as hysteric today, what do we mean? We usually mean a certain state of mind that is associated with emotional excess, a loss of self-control. We don't really see hysteria as a disease anymore. In the 19th century, on the other hand, hysteria was seen as a disease with distinct bodily symptoms, a very specific set of bodily symptoms, including paralysis, loss of sensation, or muscle contractures. And some hysterical patients adopted bizarre postures in which they arch their body backwards, like you see in this picture. And like its bodily symptoms, the etiology of hysteria was also believed to be somatic before Charcot. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates described hysteria as a disease of the womb, and the Greek word for womb was in fact hystera. So that's where the name of the disease comes from. And the belief was that the uterus of unmarried hysterical women would be too light and move around in the body, wander around the body, and thereby causing symptoms. And the therapy of hysteria was usually to marry these women off, to get them procreating, which was believed to bring the movements of the uterus to a halt. So this was the theory of hysteria before Charcot entered the scene. Charcot didn't believe that the cause of hysteria was physiological, namely a wandering womb. He rather believed that the origin of hysteria was psychological. In other words, he moved away from a physiogenic explanation, instead offering an ideogenic explanation of the disease. But still, hysteria manifested itself physically. It followed certain distinct physical laws. So Charcot went to great lengths to describe these laws, i.e. the different stages through which hysterical patients would go when they had an hysterical fit. And I want to give you an example for this. This is a famous case of one of Charcot's patients that illustrates this regularity in the different stages of the hysterical attack. And this is Charcot's patient named Augustine. Her attacks followed a characteristic pattern, including a specific set of symptoms. Here she is in her normal state. And this is the same patient, Augustine, at the beginning of an attack. So you see she's bending backwards, she's making faces. And this is the next stage, Augustine in a state of rigidity. And this was often followed by a state of hallucination. So this is all very impressive, not only because it gives us a sense of Charcot's acute observational skills, but also because it sheds light on the techniques of observation used at the Salpêtrière Hospital. So these are all photographs. And photography, in fact, played a crucial role in Charcot's medical practice. The camera was seen as an important tool for accessing the underlying disease. If the patient and her symptoms could be fixed on the photographic image, that made it easier to analyze and understand the disease. In particular, a disease as difficult and elusive as hysteria. So to Charcot, the camera became as important really as the microscope to the bacteriologist of the era. And the camera doesn't lie. That was Charcot's central conviction. Photography in general was very well institutionalized at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Charcot didn't take the pictures himself. He employed a photographer named Albert Lond. And this Albert Lond is known to have said the photographic plate is the scientist's true retina. So here we really get a sense of this great faith placed in the potentialities of photography. Any self-respecting scientist in Charcot liked to see his approach to hysteria as scientific, would rely on photography if he only had the means. Human vision was fallible, but photography was not. And I want to show you a camera that was designed by Albert Lond in the 1880s and 90s. It was designed to capture the movement of patients in hysterical convulsion. So as you see, the camera has 12 lenses with separate shutters, which could be timed, so to produce a series of pictures of an hysterical seizure. But there was another technique used at the Salpêtrière, and that's one that left a marked influence on Freud when he visited in 1985, and that is hypnosis. So hypnosis before Charcot was often seen, as charlatanry. So something practiced by stage artists and quacks, occult healers, and practitioners of that kind. It was considered to be a spectacular and also manipulative tool. Charcot disagreed with this characterization and saw the chances of using hypnosis for his own purposes. So he overcame a century-old suspicion against the practice and turned hypnosis into a neurological research tool. So we see Charcot didn't only initiate the shift in the understanding of hysteria, he also rehabilitated hypnosis or established hypnosis as a technique used in science, in the realm of science. But how did he use it as a research tool? He used it to study hysteria. And here's an image of Charcot hypnotizing a patient before an audience of medical students. He found that through hypnosis he could induce a state of hysteria in his patients. And so he hypnotized the patients in order to study their symptoms. So for example, Charcot would suggest to his subjects that their limbs would be paralyzed when they woke up from hypnosis. And when they woke up, they were indeed unable to move their legs. So it was quite effective. And in this way, Charcot was also able to remove the symptoms that he had induced through hypnotic suggestion. So in brief, he was able to produce and undo symptoms of hysteria in his patients, thus creating a controlled situation to study them. His use of hypnosis in the study of hysteria wasn't uncontroversial, though. At Nancy, in the east of France, a group working under the leadership of a man called Hippolyte Bernheim criticized Charcot, and what they said was the following. They said that Charcot only suggested symptoms in his patients. In other words, they said that hysteria wasn't real. Hysteria wasn't a disease, a real disease following ordered rules, but was rather the result of suggestion. And I want to do a reading of this picture to develop this theme further for you. So take a look at this picture painted by André Brouillet. We see Charcot lecturing. In fact, he's delivering his famous Tuesday lectures at the Salpêtrière, in which he used to give demonstrations of his patients. So we have Charcot here. And here's his patient just undergoing an hysterical fit. So she has adopted the bend backwards pose that I've shown you and described to you earlier. So if you look at the posture of the woman again and the way she's bent backwards, held by one of Charcot's assistants, and if you look around in the image, unfortunately it's too dark, so I can't really ask you to look out for it. I just show you because there's something very strange in the picture going on. If you look into this corner of the image, there's a picture on the wall with a woman doing basically the same, performing the same movement as the hysterical patient. So it looks like that the woman on the picture is imitating the hysterical fit, or rather the hysterical woman is imitating what she sees on the picture on the wall. And this is precisely what Charcot was criticized for by the Nancy school and by others, namely that hysterical symptoms weren't real. They were produced through the clinical situation. So it was the power of suggestion that would cause hysterics to imitate whatever they saw. Charcot, of course, defended himself against Bernheim, and he turned to his visual methods for legitimacy. So I put up a quote by him. He says, "It has been said that hysteria in the form Charcot described it, exists only at the Salpêtrière, as I have created this condition by my own willpower. What a marvel this would be if I could, in fact, fabricate illnesses according to my whims and fantasies. But in fact, I am a photographer. I describe what I see." But it's time now to return to our story. As I said, the young Freud had won a travel grant to Paris and went there to work with Charcot in 1885. And he was fascinated with Charcot's work. In a letter to his fiancée, he writes, "Charcot, who is one of the greatest physicians and a man whose common sense borders on genius, is simply wrecking all my aims and opinions. I sometimes come out of his lectures, as from Notre Dame, with an entirely new idea about perfection." Freud's relationship with Charcot was fairly close. At the beginning, Freud had found it difficult to get close to Charcot, but then he very smartly offered to translate some of Charcot's work into German, which Charcot accepted. And that really allowed Freud to enter Charcot's inner circle, the inner circle of his disciples. And to move on with the story, Freud is in Paris, deeply impressed by Charcot and his work on hysteria. A few months later, he returns to Vienna, and there he settles down as a bourgeois nerve doctor, like he had planned, and like Brücke had recommended to him. Freud had an old friend who helped him with this move, Joseph Breuer, who was his former colleague at the laboratory of Ernst Brücke. Breuer was in a good position to support the young Freud. He was a more senior, he was already settled down, he was a more senior nerve doctor with a very well-established practice. So he supported Freud financially and also helped his private practice by referring patients to his younger colleague. And the majority of these patients were hysterics. So what I'm going to show you now is how through Freud's and Breuer's work, hysteria gets reinterpreted once again. So we have seen that Charcot turned the physiogenic explanation of hysteria into an idiogenic one. So he was convinced that hysteria was a psychological disease. Freud and Breuer used Charcot's ideas as a starting point to develop their own theories. And this second reinterpretation of hysteria is crucial for our purposes here because it marks the birth of psychoanalysis. In 1893, Freud and Breuer published a book together called Studies on Hysteria, and the book was a collection of case studies of the hysterical patients. In the treatment of these patients, Breuer and Freud used hypnosis, much like Charcot, and developed a new therapeutic method, which they called talk therapy. And later, by the way, Freud abandoned hypnosis and replaced it with a technique he called free association, in which the patient is lying on the couch and supposed to say everything that comes to his mind to the practitioner, which is basically the stereotypical image of psychoanalytic treatment, the patient lying on the couch freely associating. So Freud drops hypnosis on the way. The first case from the book is probably the best known patient, or concerns the best known patient in the history of medicine. It was a young woman called Anna O, and her real name was actually Bertha Pappenheim, and here's a picture of her. And you can see immediately that there's an obvious class difference between patients like her, Freud's upper and middle class patients in general, and Charcot's women at the Salpetria, who were mostly working class. So Anna O becomes Breuer's patient at the age of 21. She presented with a set of bizarre symptoms, including hallucinations and hydrophobia, which is the irrational fear of water, among others. And Breuer diagnosed her with hysterical neurosis. And he developed a therapy which he believed was effective in relieving her symptoms. So what he found was that whenever Anna O related to him the content of her hallucinations, which often happened under hypnosis, she would become calm and tranquil. So Breuer and Freud saw the process as one of emotional catharsis. The patient herself described the technique as chimney sweeping or talking cure. And I also want to emphasize the difference between the treatment of Charcot's patients using his visual diagnostic technique and Freud's patients, and the treatment that was basically based on listening to what the patient said. Just as a side note. To continue with the case, at one point of her illness, Anna O's hydrophobia became worse, and she stopped drinking entirely. She could only quench her thirst through eating fruits. And one day, in a state of hypnosis, she described an occasion when she had been disgusted by the sight of a little dog drinking out of a water glass. So this was the source of her hydrophobia. And after having revealed this to Breuer, her symptoms disappeared, and she was able to drink again. So Anna O was cured from her hysterical symptoms. And from this case and other similar ones, Freud and Breuer developed their theory of psychological trauma. They famously write in their 1893 study, hysterics suffer from reminiscences. So hysterical symptoms were linked to forgotten trauma, forgotten because it was so uncomfortable to remember. And as the patient told her story, the symptoms would disappear. So hysteria was caused by traumatic memories and could be treated by bringing these traumatic memories to light. So Breuer and Freud wrote, each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked, and in arousing its accompanying effect, and the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and put the effect into words. But I haven't told you the whole story yet. There was actually more going on in the case of Anna O than Breuer revealed. Breuer actually lied in his report. Anna O wasn't cured. She rather developed a hysterical pregnancy, thinking she was pregnant from Breuer. And Breuer, when he heard that NRO accused him of being involved in a neurotic relationship with her, immediately withdrew from the treatment, just left the house, never came back, and went on a second honeymoon with his wife. NRO, alias Beta Pappenheim, got angry with Breuer, refused to speak about her therapy for the rest of her life. And after Breuer withdrew, Beta got much worse. She was institutionalized. She became a morphine addict. But later she recovered from her career as NRO and actually became one of the founders of the German feminist movement. And she became so famous as a feminist leader that she was honored in 1954 by the German government with a stamp that had a picture on it. So here's the stamp. So Breuer was hesitant about the role of sexuality in the etiology of hysteria, but Freud increasingly believed that it was of fundamental importance. And this difference in their views caused the two men to fight and eventually to break up in the late 1890s, bringing their decade-long and fruitful collaboration to an end. And Freud said, "The development of psychoanalysis afterwards cost me his friendship. It wasn't easy for me to pay such a price, but I could not escape it." And here's what Freud believed. He believed that neurosis was often caused by some sort of sexual abuse that happened in early childhood, mostly by close relatives, which is a view that he developed in his 1896 paper, Etiology of Hysteria. So the trauma causing the psychological symptoms was mostly one of sexual nature. And as you can imagine, this so-called seduction theory was shocking to late 19th century Viennese society, especially since Freud suggested that childhood abuse was much more common than expected. Among feminist critics, on the other hand, Freud's seduction theory provoked very positive reactions in the 20th century. It was a confirmation of their theories. It confirmed the female as a victim of an abusive male society. However, I should point out that it's only the early Freud, really, that met with these sympathies from feminists, because later on in his life, Freud moved away from the seduction theory and replaced it with fantasies. In part, he gave up seduction because he found that in practice he couldn't cure all of his patients by just confronting them with their supposed sexual abuse in childhood. But mostly his move was motivated by his own biography. He would have had to apply his theory of sexual seductions to account for his own neurosis. And at the time, he considered himself to be very neurotic. And that would have implicated his own parents. And although Freud's relationship to his father was, as he liked to emphasize, problematic, he didn't want to go that far. There were, in general, too many respectable fathers that would have to be excused of being perverse, including his own. So Freud stepped back from the seduction theory and suggested that hysterical symptoms were caused by fantasies rather than memories of real trauma. So Freud believed that his patients fancied their parents in early childhood, a fancy that they later became ashamed of, in which they thus repressed. And this is the famous theory of the Oedipus complex. So you all know the ancient Greek myth of Oedipus, who killed his father and married his mother. And this depicts an actor of Oedipus after he blinded himself to punish himself. In contrast to the seduction theory, Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex turned the child into an agent rather than a victim. So it was the child who fancied their parent, not the parent who abused their child. And at the same time, Freud moved away from hysteria. Instead of just explaining the genesis of this specific disease, he believed that it was mental illness in general that obeyed the laws of the psyche that he had described. So repressed memories could cause all kinds of symptoms, all kinds of neurotic symptoms, and confronting these repressed memories in the process of psychoanalytic theory could make them disappear. Seeing these processes at work in all of his patients and even in himself, I'll get to the role of Freud's own psyche and his analysis of it in a minute. Freud extended the scope of psychoanalysis. he presented psychoanalysis as a universal theory of human development, of mental illness, and of the human mind in general. And I'll present very briefly to you Freud's structural model of the self. So the ego, the superego, and the id are the three factors of the psychic apparatus. And of the three, only the ego is conscious. The superego and the id are part of the unconscious. And roughly, the ego stands for subjectivity, the superego for conscience, and the id for the drives. And they are in turn influenced by morality, by what Freud calls the reality principle, and by what he calls the pleasure principle. So the drives of the id are striving for pleasure, but this has to be negotiated with the reality principle of the ego and the morality embodied by the superego. So as you can see from this, the self as a whole is disunified. It's split between these three factors. And the goal of treatment is to harmonize the three factions. However, this universalizing claim of psychoanalysis has certain problems, which is the question, how can something that's so fixed upon the specific trauma of an individual mind, to specific childhood fantasies, etc., how can that yield a model that is supposedly universally valid, true for everyone, every human being? And the problem becomes even more pressing if you look at Freud's interpretation of dreams. Around 1895, Freud began his self-analysis, and this documentation of his self-analysis was published in 1900 under the German title of Traumdeutung, or Interpretation of Dreams. It's often considered as Freud's most important book. And in this book, Freud analyzes his own dreams, so much of the work is autobiographical. And dreams, in Freud's famous phrase, are the royal road to the unconscious. So again, we get the sense that Freud is moving from the level of the individual person, his own dreams, to a general level, to a universal theory of the mind, based on the laws discovered through the analysis of dreams. So what are the specifics of Freud's analysis of dreams? He saw dreams as analogous to hysterical symptoms. So just as hysterical symptoms are outward signs pointing at something hidden, so are dreams. Dreams have a meaning, but the meaning isn't obvious. It's encrypted because the content of dreams is intolerable to waking life. So dreams have to be decrypted, decrypted in a process called psychoanalysis. And the decryption can be the interpretation of symbol objects occurring in a dream. For example, male genitalia are represented by long things like umbrellas or trees, and female genitalia by hollow objects that can contain things like boxes, suitcases, or closets. This all sounds familiar to you, probably. Or it can be the analysis of whole situations or events that refer to real events in real life. Psychoanalysis thus becomes an interpretive technique, a hermeneutic of suspicion, as one philosopher has called it. And interpreting the dream would bring to light a meaning that is implicit in the self, but that is unknown to the self. So this meaning that is in the self but unknown, not transparent to the self, was what Freud called the unconscious. But the problem I mentioned persists. How could there be a general science of the mind based on the interpretation of an individual's dreams, which after all are highly subjective and vary from person to person? And a slightly different way of asking the question is, how can we explain the wide acceptance and even popularity of psychoanalysis? Even today, where there are at least as many critics of psychoanalysis as there are supporters. But even today, it's something that's quite universally known in the Western world. All of you have heard of the unconscious, of Freudian ideas like slips of the tongue or the Oedipus complex. So what I'd like to do now in the last couple of minutes is to present some ideas as to how psychoanalysis became so widespread. Some historians argue that a hugely important factor in the acceptance of psychoanalysis was World War I. Just after Freud has moved away from trauma towards fantasies, the situation around him radically changed. The world was at war, and it wasn't just any war. It was the most violent and bloody war that the world had ever seen. World War I was the first technological war in which tanks and chemical gas and heavy artillery were used for the first time. And in this context, a new disease emerged, shell shock. Soldiers began to show strange symptoms. They had trouble seeing, trouble hearing. They were paralyzed. They lost the ability to speak, all without having any physical wounds. So people wondered what was wrong with these soldiers. Their condition was first related to exploding shells that shocked their nervous system, hence the name shell shock. But the symptoms were also found in people who hadn't been near any exploding shells. So people started to think it was a psychological condition. Also, it was intriguing that the symptoms that the soldiers were showing very much resembled the symptoms in another disease, but a disease that almost exclusively affected women, namely hysteria. So various methods were tried in order to rehabilitate the massive numbers of soldiers lost to shell shock. They included electroshock treatment, isolation of the soldier from human contact, and talking therapy a la Freud. And indeed, talking therapy proved to be the most effective treatment. And doctors around the world began to use talking therapy in the treatment of shell-shocked soldiers. And after the war, in the treatment of other conditions as well. So the experience of war, the experience of a form of hysteria in men, male hysteria, contributed to the vindication of psychoanalysis. If World War I served to legitimize psychoanalysis, turning it into widely accepted theory and clinical practice, where are we now, almost a century later? Is Freud dead, as Time magazine asked in 1993? And here we see ourselves going back to the beginning of the lecture today, to the many meanings that psychoanalysis can assume, which makes us look for a differentiated answer. So scientifically, Freud is dead, many say. His theories are mostly regarded as obsolete. Even in psychiatric practice, psychoanalysis has been pushed to the margins. And this has largely to do with the development of antipsychotic drugs and antidepressants from the 1950s onwards, which would be a different story to tell, which offered and continues to offer a compelling alternative to talk therapy. So if you think about it, talk therapy takes much longer, involves much more effort than just taking a pill, and is much more expensive. And yet, I want to suggest that the Freudian vision persists. Freud's science of the mind has influenced us more than we might think. It's not just that some key psychoanalytic concepts like repression or the unconscious or the Freudian slip of the tongue have entered our everyday language. It's also the very idea that we should talk about our feelings instead of being embarrassed by them. This Freudian idea has really become common sense. So when we are sad, when we believe that letting it all out, talking to somebody, helps. Sharing our feelings with another person, be it a friend or family member or colleague or counselor or analyst, makes us feel better. And this, to a large extent, we owe to Freud and to psychoanalysis. And some of this history I told you about today. Thank you. Right. Sure. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yes. I'm wondering what the medical profession thinks now of what the causes of the hysteria, and if we describe it in the same way now, do we still call it hysteria, or does it have different names for different symptoms?
It doesn't actually exist as a disease anymore. So it's not listed as a disease in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for the Disease of the Psychiatric Association. So it's not considered a disease anymore. It has basically turned into everyday language. It's a historical disease like other diseases such as neurasthenia. that coexisted with hysteria at the time. So one could say it has been absorbed by other disease categories, such as depression or even some form of psychosis. But as a disease, as a distinct disease entity, it doesn't exist anymore. Yeah?
What is the scientific status of Freud's thought? I mean, do people think there's some validity to it, or is it simply rejected?
It's generally, as I said, it's mostly considered as obsolete, which is why Freud is mostly taught today. Well, he's still taught, he's still considered important, but he's mostly taught in departments of languages, of philosophy, of history, and less so in science departments. So although there's still a distinct number of psychoanalytic practitioners who believe that the theories of Freud are true, are correct, overall it's marginalized by the medical profession and by mainstream medicine. Yeah?
But any of those patients that they thought were classifying as having hysteria, could any of them have been suffering from epilepsy?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was actually a consideration because Charcot kept them on the same ward with his epilepsy patients. So he was a neurologist. And there was this idea, and historians have worked on that the hysterical patients actually imitated what they saw. So the hysterical fit was also an imitation of the epileptic fit. Yeah. And it's also one of the diseases, of the modern diseases that still exist, that's believed to be a disease that hysteria has been absorbed into because it has a very similar phenomenology. Although there's a biological cause, it's not a psychological disease. Yeah.
You touched at the beginning of your lecture on Gustav Mahler.
Sorry? On
Mahler.
Yeah.
I've read that he consulted Freud. How much is known of that?
That he consulted for as a patient.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of that. Perhaps you can tell us more about that.
No, I just read that he consulted Freud, but Freud gave him like a one-session consultation. I don't know any more than that. I saw email.
Right. Unfortunately, I don't know. It's quite exceptional because most of Freud's patients were young women. So to have a male patient is it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask you about the photography of Albert Mondet with Charcot? I'm a little skeptical of those images. I mean, certainly by the 1890s, films were becoming a little more sensitive, but taking in a darker room in a clinical situation, somebody who's in a fit, who's thrashing, whose face is, they seem naturally sharp to me. And I'm a little skeptical worrying there may be if anyone's investigated that to see if they are posed or they are genuine images of somebody in one of these.
That's a very good point. I mean, if you remember also the pictures, they were highly artistic and one might say artificial. For example, the last stage of this hallucinating woman just looking at the head, into the sky. So there's something very artistic about these images. And you're right. From a technological point of view, it just would take time to actually to capture these positions on film. So I wouldn't say, well, these were fake productions. I think that there was an honest belief of these scientists in doing something that's scientific, in using this ideal of mechanical objectivity, so looking through the lens of the camera to get a more objective view of the subject. But of course, we have to wonder to what extent this is also mixed up with artificial and artistic expression. And Charcot, in fact, was a very artistic person. So in the beginning, before he embarked on studying medicine, he was interested in drawing, and we have lots of beautiful sketches also done by him of his patients. So he had a very artistic nature, and that's surely also reflected in his photographic representations. Yeah?
Are the ones where he had the 12 lenses any better, any less fake looking? You know, when he took the 12 lenses, presumably taking them almost as a movie.
the thing is, we have the published photographs of Charcot, and we can assume with some certainty that they were produced by these cameras, of which we have the models and the pictures, but also by the very process of publishing these photographs, there was a process of selection taking place. And if you look at it's called the Iconographie de la Salpêtrière, it's beautiful photographs, beautiful copies of these images, fairly large also. So you really get these albums that, of course, were also carefully chosen to present his patients and his technique in a good light. Yeah?
I just wanted to ask, to go back to the Victorians, if Freud wasn't published in English until it came out for the first time in the Hogarth Press, like in the 1920s, how much of a presence was his thought in British life earlier than that? Thomas Hardy, H. Lawrence, any of the writers or thinkers of the late Victorians in England. Did they read Freud in the German?
So yeah, Freud was part of this larger movement, psychoanalytic movement, and the orientation of that movement was quite international. Many practitioners read him in the original in German before he was translated. You're right that happened later, but his popularity and the popularity and vindication of psychoanalytic theories, as I said, had largely to do with World War I and the developments there. And there was especially one psychoanalytic practitioner, W.H. Rivers, who worked in the UK using Freudian methods to rehabilitate his soldier patients. So within the clinical realm, we can say that the idea spread to England quite quickly. In the cultural realm, I would suggest that there was a delay until it was taken up by broader culture. Yeah.
As our medical military system is getting overwhelmed by returning veterans with traumatic stress disorder, makes me think of your comments about shell shock. Would you like to contrast those diagnoses? Are they really parts of the same? Or are they really different?
That's an interesting question. So it touches on the larger history of the DSM, the statistical manual, basically the diagnostic key of the of psychiatry in America. And PTSD is the only disease category there that is of a Freudian kind, in the sense that it goes back to the patient's biography and takes into account trauma. Apart from that, all the Freudian stuff has been written out of the DSM from 1980 onwards, when the third edition of the DSM came out. So in the early editions, from the 1950s onwards, 1952 was the first edition. It was very much dominated by Freudian ideas. But through a movement called the Neo-Kraepelinian movement, which basically was an anti-Freudian movement within the history of psychiatry, which also had to do with the development of drugs, psychopharmacological drugs. I briefly mentioned that. Freudian ideas dropped out of the DSM, but PTSD is the only diagnosis that's still in there that actually takes into account trauma. So there's a very strong parallel between shell shock and PTSD. Yeah?
You haven't mentioned anything about Charles Jung, and I'm wondering, where does his work intersect with any of this with Freud? Because I know they work together.
Yeah, so Freud had a lot of students, and many of the students became very famous and prominent members in the psychoanalytic movement themselves. Many of them broke with Freud at some point. Jung was one of them. He was mostly involved in developing further the concept of the unconscious. So it's unconscious psychology that he developed further. Yeah?
During that time, Charcot's time, was surgery ever used as an attempt to cure him?
So surgery within the history of psychiatry is part of a set of somatic treatments that came up a little later, so in the 1930s and 40s. So you might be thinking of things like lobotomy, psychosurgery. That's a little later. And that's actually an interesting development because it in parts developed against talk therapy and against Freudian approaches to treating the mind. So we have psychosurgery, but also the shock treatments, electroshock treatment, which is still in use, although for different purposes to treat depression today, but also insulin treatment, insulin shock treatment, and other forms of quite drastic somatic treatments that were supposed to treat the mind. Yeah?
How much did Freud and others around him understand about the physiology of the brain and things like the role of the amygdala and different parts of the brain, the frontal cortex and all that? Was that understood at all?
Mm-hmm. So Freud was actually knew a fair deal of the brain. So he worked as a neuropathologist, did a lot of anatomical, histological studies of the brain. So specifically the amygdala, I think, is a 20th century discovery or description or the association of the amygdala with emotions. But largely the overall structure of the brain was well known. Localization of function is something that developed over the course of the 19th century. And by the time Freud began to do his work, people knew, for example, about the two speech areas. So Wernicke described the sensory speech area in the 1870s, and Broca actually was slightly earlier in the 1860s. So they had a fair amount of knowledge about the localization of different higher functions on the brain, but not so much about emotion and emotional circuits, to my knowledge. Yeah?
I read, but particularly it's only mentioned tangentially, that Freud's psychoanalysis was quite fearless and was painful and perhaps more profound than just giving credit. And I want you to study.
Yeah, Sorry? Shall I repeat? So the question is whether I can comment on the fact that Freud's self-analysis was a very brave act of self-reflection, right, and inwardness. And I agree with that. And Freud liked to emphasize that himself. That it was actually his most heroic act in life to confront his own psyche, analyze his own dreams, and then evaluate the results of that. And he did so in his interpretation of dreams, which is a big book, and it's a fascinating read. And of course, much of it is also very personal because he interprets his own dreams, and things come up like his relationship with his father, and other things that he found very difficult. He personally found very difficult to face and to write about. Yeah.
Were these photographs kept within the confines of the medical community, or were they made public? Because I would think that there would be some kind of moral outcry. There was something awfully exploitative and inhumane about some of these photographs and some of the things that these women were subjected to.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that at the time this was so much of an issue. I think that's more our modern sensibilities. And the photographs were actually pretty much confined to the academic context. So they appeared in academic journals, neurological medical journals, and circulated among the medical community more than anything else. Which doesn't mean that certain broader cultural ideas went into these photographs and were reflected by these photographs. So there's some work by historians on the fact that some of these photographs dealt with or engaged with certain ideas of anti-clericalism in France. So there's clearly a sense in which certain political, religious ideas entered into how these photographs were made. Yeah? Sorry. I meant this lady, but perhaps we can have you afterwards.
I'm interested in his reversal of the original theory that these women were sexually abused that became their fantasizing. And I wondered, in his self-diagnosis, did he ever confront the fact that this might have been repression because he didn't want to deal with his father's sexual abuse?
So this is actually, I think, the most plausible reason why he moved away from the seduction hypothesis towards fantasies. Not to my knowledge. That's historical interpretation. That he dropped it because he was skeptical or afraid of the consequences of making this a general statement. Yeah?
Why did they heroin and hysteria, not something like schizophrenia, where they all lumped all the diseases lumped into the one title, hysteria? Did they not have autistic children, even though they didn't use that term in those days, or schizophrenic, or any of the bipolar diseases? Why was it strictly hysteria?
So for Charcot, I think the question is more difficult to answer because of his patient pool, and there were surely also psychotic schizophrenic patients, although that's also a disease category that wasn't clearly defined at the time. For Freud, there's a fairly easy reason, which is his patient population. They were all middle-class female patients, and hysteria was, in Vienna at the time, a disease category that somebody wouldn't mind having. So it was much better to be diagnosed and treated as hysteric than to be sent to an asylum, because asylums weren't very pleasant places at the time. And it was also a class thing that it was preferable to be treated by a private nerve doctor in private practice as a hysteric patient, just being at home, having the doctor come by every day for a session of talk therapy. So there was clearly this class demarcation that hysterical patients were middle class, well educated, well off patients in Freud's case. Yeah?
What do you think the diseases that are listed now in the Freud manual?
Well, I'm a historian. I study the past. I don't do predictions about the future. It's a very good question. Well, there is currently a revision underway of the DSM, and it will be very interesting to see what's there. But clearly, there's a dominance still of the psychopharmacological drugs, and increasingly diagnosis is also determined by whichever responds to a certain drug. So you wouldn't necessarily sketch out different. There's a list of symptoms for depression, clinical depression, for example, but it's also defined as something that responds to giving an antidepressant. And with more development of drugs, I imagine that this will also reflect upon the diagnostics of different diseases.
I want to mention that there's a book that Dr. Gunther is just finishing on this very topic. Is that right?
Well, it's about reflexes, but around that time, also in Germany, not just Vienna, but Germany. And there's a chapter on Freud.
Any other questions? Well, thanks very, very much.
Thank you. Patients were middle class, well educated.